Margaret had taught at Lincoln High for 37 years, but she'd never had a student jump from the school roof before. What she didn't know was that the boy who died had been searching for her his entire life, and that his suicide note contained just 3 words that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her past. Margaret Carson stood at her classroom window, watching the paramedics load a covered stretcher into the ambulance. The Lincoln High School courtyard, usually bustling with teenage energy, was eerily quiet. Students huddled in small groups, their faces pale with shock, while teachers moved among them offering comfort and tissues. At 55, Margaret had seen her share of teenage crises. She'd counseled kids through divorce, depression, abuse, and addiction. She'd attended funerals for students lost to car accidents and cancer. But suicide was different. Suicide left questions that could never be answered and guilt that could never be fully absolved. The boy's name was Daniel Mitchell. 17 years old, junior class, average grades, no obvious red flags. According to his classmates, he'd seemed normal that morning, maybe quieter than usual, but nothing that would have raised alarms. He'd attended his first 3 classes. Then sometime during lunch period, he'd climbed to the roof of the administration building and jumped. Margaret barely knew Daniel. He wasn't in any of her advanced placement English classes, and their paths rarely crossed in the hallways. She might have exchanged pleasantries with him once or twice, but he was one of the anonymous faces in a school of 1,500 students. Just another kid counting down the days until graduation, which made what happened next all the more unsettling. Principal Davis knocked on her classroom door around 4 p.m. after the last of the crisis counselors had packed up their materials and headed home. "Margaret, I need to speak with you about Daniel Mitchell." She turned from the window where she'd been standing for the better part of an hour. "Of course. How can I help?" Davis closed the door behind him and handed her a folded piece of paper. "The police found this in Daniel's locker. It's addressed to you." Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that suggested the writer had taken time to make sure every word was legible. "Mrs. Carson, I know this will be a shock, but I need you to know the truth before I go. I've been watching you for months, trying to work up the courage to talk to you. I found you through the adoption records when I turned 18 last month. You probably don't remember me, but you gave birth to me 17 years ago at St. Mary's Hospital. You were 17 then, just a kid yourself. I'm not angry. I understand why you had to give me up, but I needed to see you, to know what kind of person my birth mother was. I've been sitting in the back of the library during your lunch duties, watching you help students with their college essays. You're kind, patient, everything I hoped you would be. I wanted to tell you who I was, but I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't want to see me. Afraid I'd ruin the life you built after you gave me away. Afraid that meeting me would bring back painful memories you'd worked hard to forget. But I also can't keep living this lie. My adoptive parents are good people, but they never understood me. I've been depressed for years, and it's gotten worse since I found you. Not because of you, because of me, because I realize I'll never fit anywhere, never really belong to anyone. I just wanted you to know that I found you, and that you don't have to feel guilty about what happened all those years ago. You were just a kid making an impossible choice. Tell Mrs. Carson I found her." Daniel Margaret sank into her desk chair, the letter fluttering to the floor. The room seemed to tilt around her as memories she'd buried for decades came flooding back. Margaret had been 17 years old, a senior at Lincoln High School, the same school where she now taught. She'd been a good student, bound for college on an academic scholarship, with dreams of becoming a writer or journalist. Then she'd fallen in love with Tommy Rodriguez, a charming boy from the wrong side of town who made her feel alive in ways her sheltered suburban upbringing never had. When she discovered she was pregnant in January of her senior year, her world collapsed. Abortion wasn't an option, not in her conservative Catholic family, not in the small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But keeping the baby would have meant giving up college, giving up her future, disappointing parents who'd sacrificed everything for her education. Her mother had arranged everything with ruthless efficiency. Margaret was sent to live with an aunt in another state for the final months of her pregnancy, supposedly to help with the new baby the family was expecting. The story was that she'd graduated early and was taking a gap year before college. She'd given birth to a son on August 15th, 1989. She'd held him for exactly 10 minutes before the adoption counselor took him away. She'd never even given him a name. That was for his new parents to decide. She'd signed the papers, taken the sealed envelope containing information about the adoptive family, which she'd never opened, and tried to forget it had ever happened. She'd returned home in time for college orientation, thrown herself into her studies, and built a life that had no room for the ghost of a baby she'd never really known. She'd become a teacher because she loved working with young people, but she'd never married, never had other children. The secret of her teenage pregnancy had remained buried for 37 years. Until now. Margaret picked up the letter with shaking hands and read it again. Daniel Mitchell, born August 15th, 1989. The same day, the same year, the same hospital. There was no doubt the son she'd given away had found her, and instead of the reunion she'd sometimes fantasized about in her darkest moments, he'd chosen to die. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction she'd had with Daniel Mitchell, trying to remember if she'd seen him in the library during her lunch duties, trying to understand how she could have been so close to her own son without recognizing him. The next morning, she called in sick for the first time in 15 years and drove to the public library. If Daniel had found her through adoption records, there might be a trail she could follow backward. Information about his life, his family, the circumstances that had led him to that roof. The adoption had been handled through Catholic Family Services, an agency that had since merged with another organization and moved locations 3 times. But public records were public records, and Margaret had taught enough research papers to know how to dig for information. What she found broke her heart all over again. Daniel Mitchell had been adopted by Robert and Susan Mitchell, a middle-aged couple who'd struggled with infertility for years. By all accounts, they'd been loving parents who'd provided Daniel with every advantage: good schools, music lessons, sports teams, college preparation. But the records also showed a pattern of behavioral issues that had started in middle school and escalated through high school. Depression, anxiety, several suicide attempts that had been hushed up by the family, therapists, psychiatrists, residential treatment programs. The Mitchells had tried everything to help their son, but nothing had seemed to work. Margaret found newspaper clippings from Daniel's high school newspaper. He'd been a talented writer, just like she'd been at his age. His essays were haunting, beautiful pieces about isolation and the search for identity. One piece, written just 6 months before his death, was titled "The Ghost in the Mirror." I look in mirrors and see a stranger's face looking back at me, not because I don't recognize my features, but because I don't recognize the person behind them. I am a collection of borrowed traits from people I've never met, shaped by experiences that began before my first memory. I am the sum of someone else's choices. living in a life that was designed for me by people who knew nothing about who I really was. Sometimes I wonder if I'm real at all, or just a placeholder for the child my parents really wanted, the biological child they never got to have. Sometimes I wonder if my birth mother ever thinks about me, and whether she'd be proud or disappointed by what I became. Mostly, I wonder if I'll ever feel like I belong anywhere, or if I'll always be the ghost haunting someone else's life. Margaret had to stop reading. The pain in his words was unbearable, made worse by the knowledge that she could have answered his questions if only he'd been brave enough to approach her. But why hadn't he? What had stopped him from simply walking up to her desk and saying, "Mrs. Carson, I think you're my birth mother"? The answer came from an unexpected source. Margaret was in her empty classroom the next day, packing up 37 years of teaching materials, when one of her former students knocked on her door. "Mrs. Carson, I heard about your retirement announcement. I wanted to say goodbye." It was Jessica Chen, who'd graduated 3 years earlier and was now home from college for spring break. Jessica had been one of Margaret's favorite students, bright, thoughtful, and mature beyond her years. "Jessica, how lovely to see you. How's college treating you?" "Really well, thanks. I'm majoring in psychology now, which is actually why I wanted to talk to you." Jessica hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Mrs. Carson, I know about Daniel Mitchell, about what happened." Margaret's hands stilled on the box she was packing. "Oh, he was my friend. Not super close, but we were in peer counseling together. He talked to me sometimes about things that were bothering him." "What kinds of things?" Jessica looked uncomfortable. He'd been trying to find his birth mother for months. He hired some online service to search adoption records, and when he found out she was a teacher at our school, he got really excited. But then what? Then he found out about the rumors. Margaret felt cold. "What rumors?" Jessica shifted her weight from foot to foot. "Mrs. Carson, there have been stories about you for years. Students talk. They say you had an affair with a student back in the 80s, that you got pregnant and had to leave school for a while. That's why you never got married, why you're so strict about appropriate boundaries with students." The room spun around Margaret. That's not what happened. I know that. Most of us with any sense knew the rumors were garbage. But Daniel, he heard the stories and believed them. He thought his birth mother was someone who'd slept with a student and gotten pregnant. He was ashamed to approach you because he thought you'd be ashamed of him. Margaret sank into her chair as the full tragedy became clear. Daniel had found her, but the poisonous gossip that had followed her throughout her career had convinced him that she was someone he couldn't respect. He'd spent months watching her from afar, torn between wanting to know her and believing she was someone he could never be proud to call his mother. "Jessica, those rumors, they're not true. I was 17 when I got pregnant. The father was my boyfriend, another student. I gave the baby up for adoption and never spoke about it because it was private and painful." Jessica nodded. "I figured it was something like that." But Daniel didn't know how to separate the truth from the gossip. He said he wanted to ask you directly, but he was afraid of what he might find out. So instead, he decided to die. I think he decided he'd rather die than discover his birth mother was someone he couldn't respect. And he'd rather die than approach you and risk being rejected. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room with a glass of wine and the sealed envelope she'd kept in her safe deposit box for 37 years. She'd never opened it, the information about Daniel's adoptive family, because she'd promised herself she would respect their privacy and never interfere with his life. But Daniel was gone now, and the promises she'd made to protect him no longer mattered. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with basic information about Robert and Susan Mitchell. Good people, the agency had noted, financially stable, emotionally mature, deeply committed to providing a loving home for their adopted son. There was also a photograph, a professional portrait of the Mitchells holding a baby. Margaret stared at the infant's face, searching for traces of herself or Tommy Rodriguez. The baby looked like every other newborn, red-faced, wrinkled, with that unfocused gaze that suggested he was still figuring out how to be in the world. But there was something else in the envelope. A second photograph, this one dated 6 months later. The same baby now sitting up and smiling, with the kind of joy that suggested he was thriving in his new home. On the back, someone had written, Daniel Robert Mitchell, 8 months old, happy and healthy. Margaret had missed watching her son learn to smile, to sit up, to take his first steps. She'd missed his first words, his first day of school, his first heartbreak. She'd missed everything that mattered, all to protect a secret that had become twisted into something ugly by people who knew nothing about the truth. But she could still do something for him now. Margaret spent the weekend writing, not lesson plans or college recommendation letters, but the truth about her relationship with Daniel Mitchell. She wrote about being 17 and pregnant and terrified. She wrote about the choice to give him up for adoption and the decades of wondering what had become of him. She wrote about the rumors that had haunted her career and how they'd prevented her son from feeling safe enough to approach her. Most importantly, she wrote about the kind of person Daniel had been, based on the research she'd done into his life and the glimpses she'd caught during the months he'd been watching her from the library. On Monday morning, Margaret's last day of teaching, she stood before the entire school during an emergency assembly and told Daniel's story. She told the truth about her past, about the baby she'd given up, about the young man who died because rumors and shame had kept him from knowing he was loved. Daniel Mitchell was my son, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. I gave birth to him when I was 17 years old, and I gave him up for adoption because I wanted him to have opportunities I couldn't provide. For 37 years, I wondered what had become of him. I never searched for him because I believed his privacy and his family's privacy were more important than my curiosity. The auditorium was completely silent. Students and teachers alike stared at her in shock. Daniel spent the last months of his life watching me from the library, trying to work up the courage to tell me who he was. But he'd heard rumors about how he was conceived, and those rumors made him ashamed to approach me. He died believing his birth mother was someone he couldn't respect, when the truth was that I was someone who would have been proud to know him. Margaret's voice broke slightly, but she continued, I'm telling you this because secrets have power only when we let them stay in the dark. The rumors about me have followed me throughout my career, and they ultimately cost my son his life. Daniel was a talented writer, a thoughtful young man who struggled with depression and questions about his identity. He deserved better than to die believing lies about where he came from. She pulled out the essays Daniel had written for the school newspaper. I want to read you something Daniel wrote 6 months ago. It's called The Ghost in the Mirror, and it's about the search for identity that consumed the last years of his life. As Margaret read her son's words aloud to the assembled school, she could see students and teachers wiping their eyes. The pain in his writing was palpable, but so was his talent and his deep desire to understand himself and his place in the world. Daniel Mitchell was not a ghost, Margaret concluded. He was a real person with real feelings and real talent. He was my son, and I would have been proud to know him. I hope that by telling his story, our story, I can help other students who are struggling with questions about identity and belonging. and I hope that we can all learn to be more careful about the stories we tell about each other, because those stories have power to heal or to harm. Margaret's revelation sent shockwaves through Lincoln High School and the larger community. The local newspaper picked up the story, then regional outlets, then national news. Margaret found herself at the center of conversations about teenage pregnancy, adoption, mental health, and the damage that gossip could do to real lives. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Former students reached out to share their own stories of struggle and resilience. Adoptees contacted her to discuss their searches for birth parents. Mental health advocates used Daniel's story to promote better support systems for teenagers dealing with depression and identity issues. But the most meaningful response came from Robert and Susan Mitchell. They contacted Margaret a week after the assembly and asked to meet with her. The conversation was awkward at first. Two sets of parents who'd loved the same child in different ways, brought together by tragedy. "We always wondered if Daniel would want to find you someday," Susan Mitchell said. "We supported the idea, but we wanted it to be his choice and his timeline." "He was struggling so much in the last year," Robert added. "We knew he'd found you, but we didn't know he was afraid to approach you. If we'd known—" "You couldn't have known," Margaret said gently. "I couldn't have known either. We all did the best we could with the information we had." The Mitchells shared photos of Daniel throughout his life: birthday parties, school plays, family vacations. Margaret saw glimpses of herself in his expressions, Tommy Rodriguez in his smile. But mostly, she saw a young man who'd been loved and supported, even as he struggled with demons that ultimately proved too powerful. "He was a good kid," Susan said through tears. "Complicated, sometimes difficult, but fundamentally good. He would have made a difference in the world if he'd found a way to stay in it." Margaret agreed to speak at Daniel's memorial service. The church was packed with students, teachers, family friends, and members of the community who'd been touched by his story. Margaret talked about the brief glimpse she'd gotten into his writing and his character, and about the tragedy of two people who'd loved each other but never gotten the chance to know it. "Daniel spent his life searching for connection and belonging," she told the gathering. "He found me, but he was afraid to let me find him. I want his death to remind us all that the people we love need to hear it, the people we're proud of need to know it, and the stories we tell about each other have the power to build bridges or burn them down." Margaret cleaned out her classroom on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Daniel's death and 1 week after his memorial service. 37 years of teaching reduced to a handful of boxes and a lifetime of memories. She'd been offered opportunities to speak publicly about adoption, mental health, and the dangers of gossip. Publishers had contacted her about writing a book. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story, but Margaret was tired. She'd spent her career teaching other people's children, and now she wanted time to grieve the son she'd never really known. She placed the last of her personal items in a box: a photo of her first graduating class, a coffee mug from a student who'd gone on to become a doctor, a paperweight from the year she'd been named Teacher of the Year. At the bottom of her desk drawer, she found something she'd forgotten: a short story Daniel had submitted to the school literary magazine 3 months before his death. The story was titled "The Teacher's Secret," and it was about a high school student who discovers that his English teacher is actually his birth mother. In the story, the boy works up the courage to approach her, they have an emotional reunion, and they both find healing through their connection. It was fiction, but it was also clearly Daniel's fantasy, the ending he'd wanted but had been too afraid to pursue. Margaret folded the story carefully and placed it in the box with her other treasures. It would be her last assignment from Daniel Mitchell, and her first real glimpse into the heart of the son she'd never gotten to know. As she turned off the lights and locked her classroom door for the final time, Margaret realized that retirement wouldn't be about ending her career as a teacher. It would be about beginning her education as Daniel's mother, learning who he'd been, honoring his memory, and making sure his story helped other young people find the connections they needed to stay in the world. The final exam she'd never expected to take was just beginning. 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of another auditorium, this one filled with adoption professionals, mental health advocates, and teenagers who'd aged out of the foster care system. She was giving a presentation about the importance of open communication in adoption, using Daniel's story as a case study in what could go wrong when shame and secrecy created barriers between people who needed each other. "My son Daniel died believing he wasn't worthy of love," she told the audience. But the truth was that he was surrounded by love. From his adoptive parents, from me, from teachers and friends who saw his potential. He just couldn't see it himself because the stories he'd heard about his origins made him feel ashamed of where he came from. After her presentation, a teenage girl approached her. She was about 17, with dark hair and serious eyes that reminded Margaret painfully of Daniel. "Mrs. Carson, I'm adopted too, and I've been thinking about finding my birth parents, but I'm scared of what I might find out." Margaret looked at the girl, so young, so vulnerable, so much like Daniel had been, and made a decision that surprised her. "Would you like to practice?" she asked. "I could help you figure out what questions to ask and how to ask them. I could help you prepare for whatever answers you might get." The girl nodded eagerly, and Margaret realized she'd just found her new purpose. She couldn't save Daniel, but maybe she could help other young people navigate the complicated process of finding their families without losing themselves in the search. Margaret had always been a teacher. Now she was teaching the most important lesson of all, how to build connections across the gaps that life creates, and how to love people enough to help them find their way home. Daniel's story had ended in tragedy, but it didn't have to be the end of the story. It could be the beginning of something better, a world where adopted children and birth parents could find each other without shame, where teenagers struggling with identity could get the support they needed, where secrets lost their power to destroy lives. Margaret pulled out her phone and called the girl who'd approached her after the presentation. "Hi, Sarah. It's Mrs. Carson. I was thinking about what you said, about wanting to find your birth parents. Would you like to come over for dinner this week? I think I might be able to help you figure out where to start." As she listened to Sarah's excited response, Margaret looked up at the sky and whispered, "This one's for you, Daniel. I'm going to do better this time." The final exam continued, but now Margaret had help from Daniel's memory, from the lessons his death had taught her, and from the young people who still needed someone to believe they were worthy of love. Sometimes the most important tests came after you thought school was over.